At the outbreak of war in 1914, one of the most important pieces of kit that an officer brought with him to the front was his sword. This might seem like quite an antiquated piece of equipment, out of place in 20th century warfare. However, it was actually a very effective weapon, and when combined with the service revolver, was really as effective as the rifle and bayonet carried by the other ranks. In this video then, we'll look at the Manual of Infantry Sword Exercise 1895, and what it can tell us about how the sword was used in battle.
Before we start, a quick note on the officer's sword itself. While most regiments used the standard 1902 infantry officer's sword, there were different designs for some units, for example rifles and Highland regiments. For the purpose of this video, I'll be using the 1863 Highland pattern officer's claymore. Although it bears no resemblance to the two-handed sword of the same name, that was the official term for this sword during the period. The guard is the traditional Scottish basket shape, but it's not a basket-hilted broadsword, as it's sometimes incorrectly called. The blade is in fact almost identical to that of the other swords used by the army at the time, and has only one edge. The blades of all the infantry officers' swords were straight, and this has given rise to the myth that they were intended only for thrusting. Nothing could be further from the truth, however. As we shall see from the 1895 sword exercises, there was only one thrust used with the sword, and many more cuts. Before going on active service, the first 17 inches of the blade were sharpened to aid with cutting, and it was most certainly intended to be used in close quarter fighting. All movements with the sword began from the on guard position. The thrust at the full extent of the arm gave the same reach as the thrust with the rifle and bayonet, making them very equal weapons on the battlefield. The advantage of the sword, however, came from the ability to cut at one's opponent, as well as thrust. More powerful blows, known as circling cuts, could be directed against any part of the body. Note how the arm is moved in line with the forehead here, without ever crossing or blocking the line of sight. Various parries were employed, and were effective against both the sword and the bayonet.
And finally, we see the sword in use to parry a variety of cuts and thrusts. Note here how the bayonet thrust is parried, and then circling cut number 1 immediately used to resume the offensive. These exercises were practiced by infantry officers until they became second nature, and the army of the period created some of the best swordsmen in the world. Although the sword would soon be removed from the battlefield, as it made officers an obvious target for the enemy, during the opening months of the war, it was regarded as, and indeed proved itself to be, a very effective weapon, and equally as useful as the bayonet.